Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
Hello, Mitakiyepi, and welcome to Hochoka, here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus. I am Scott Wooster, today's Hochoka host. We're glad you have joined our circle to hear Dr. Damian Costello, a Catholic theologian who specializes in Indigenous spiritual traditions and serves as Director of Postgraduate Studies at NATES, an Indigenous learning community. Damian was a Hochoka Season 1 guest, and we are very excited to have him return. He is with us in a 3-part series that brings us fresh perspectives on Catholicism through an Indigenous lens. Today, we learn about the first Native Christian who led a successful 15-year revolt against the conquistadors in what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Welcome, Damian. It's nice to have you back in the studio today. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to learn a little bit about this Indigenous hero. He stood against colonization. And why do you think that his story is worth knowing?
I think it's important that we know his story, particularly here at St. Joseph's Indian School, because it's the hidden story of Christianity and Native peoples in the Americas. So we know the dominant story, which is very accurate, of the conquistadors, the conquest of Mexico and Peru, all the way up through, the settling of the West and boarding schools and all of that. Enriquillo is that underside, the hidden underside of Native peoples who engaged Christianity, but stood against colonization.
Okay. And I know very little, as most people and probably a lot of the viewers do, about Enriquillo. Can you tell me a little bit about his story? I understand that at least the first part of it was marked by tragedy, and just give us a little idea of what that looked like.
So he was from the island of what we call Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And that was called Quisqueya, the mother of all lands, by the Taino people who lived there. There's probably about 300,000, maybe 1 million. It's hard to tell. But he was from the most important kingdom, Jaragua, on the western part. And he was a noble. He was the great grandnephew of Anacaona, famous queen. And he was born just a few years after the Spanish arrived in 1492. And he was at the famous massacre in 1503. The Spanish, that was the last kingdom to be conquered. They invited Anacaona, all the nobles, to a feast, an indoor feast, and they set it on fire, treachery. And so Enriquillo saw his father killed. And Anacaona was taken to Santo Domingo, the capital of the island, of the colony, and publicly hanged. And so he grew up an orphan. He was raised partially by Franciscans, educated by them. And when he became of age, he was a cacique, a chief. And the way that the labor system worked is that as a chief, you would bring your people to a colonist, and you would be in charge of running the labor for that colonist. And so he migrated to a different part of the island and found his people to be very significantly oppressed. They were only 100 in his band left. The numbers in the whole island were maybe 29,000 at this point, 1519. And the whole world had collapsed basically for him and his Taino people.
Okay. Definitely a lot of tragedy as a young man then. So how did he take that tragedy and turn it into something different? How did he overcome?
Well, in 1519, he was unique in that he had a horse, right? Not many natives at this point had a horse, and that was taken, I think, by the colonist he worked for, and his wife was abused. And in a shift of labor, rotations, he and a group of his followers rose up and headed to the mountains. This is a very sort of arid part of the country, but up in the mountains there's pine forests, much like in the Black Hills. And he beat off the colonist army with like rocks and sticks and maybe some improvised bows and arrows. And they went up into the hills and they set a rotating village. So they'd have maybe 3 or 4 different small villages where they'd plant their crops, cassava. They hunted the wild pigs that the Spaniards had brought. And they were able to successfully evade the Spaniards for for years.
Mm-hmm.
And they raided the Spaniards. The colonists would send out these armies into the land. They'd search for months. They couldn't find them. There's this great quote where one of the colonists says, in this terrain, you need a different pair of sandals for every day. It was so rough and remote. They raised chickens and they cut their tongues out so that they couldn't call and couldn't be discovered. And the Spaniards were afraid that this revolt would grow into taking over the whole island. They made alliances with other smaller rebel groups and accepted African slaves were just being imported, and runaways were accepted into their community as well.
Okay. So you argue that his spirituality was an important part of that story in what they were trying to do in the mountains and just a part of his life. What did that look like for him?
Well, one interesting part of Enriquillo is that there's no question that he embraced his Catholic education that he received as a kid. When visitors actually found his village, like they would accept, people every once in a while for sort of negotiations, like a couple of people here and there. And they said there's crosses in all of the houses. One of the terms of one treaty they made, the Spaniards gave a bunch of tribute to him, a bunch of gifts, including he requested a bell for their church. And he was known for saying the rosary as he watched the camp at night. So he would stay up late, as a sentry. And he was always in his armor. He wore a robe over it, like a Franciscan-style robe. And they said he always had two swords, with him as he watched over the village. And one of those swords was a rosary. Like one of the Catholic names of the rosaries are Lady's Sword. And so, Spaniards were very insistent, like, this is a crusade, we're doing God's work. And part of Enrique's faith was this demonstration, like, no, that's not what this faith is all about. This is about living as a community. One important part of his witness is that he seemed to have taken this idea of just war seriously. Like, if you're forced to practice war, if you have to go to defend yourself, there's certain things you can't do. So there's this great story of about 70 Spaniards being trapped in a cave, and some of his followers wanted to burn them out. They take revenge on them, very understandably. And Enrique said, "No, we're gonna disarm them. We're gonna let them go." And one of them had taken a vow that if he survived this incident, one of the Spaniards, he'd become a priest, and he ended up becoming a Dominican priest.
Okay.
And at the same time, we should be certain to say that the Taino practices must have survived. We don't know a lot about them, but one ceremonial practice was the arrietos, which were these long communal sort of epic poems, very much like the Navajo have all these all-night songs that recount their creation story. So they must have been sung and reenacted in their village as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. So his introduction to Catholicism, to make sure I'm getting it right, was brought to him by the conquerors, by the Spaniards that came to the area, correct?
Yes, but it's a little ironic because the Spaniards who came had no interest in the faith. These are very small, sort of mafia-type groups, right, that are looking for territory, they're looking for resources, and they do nothing to sort of spread even church institutions for themselves. Like there's this great quote by Pizarro, who conquered the Incas. This annoying priest shows up and says, aren't we going to try converting these people when we conquer them? He's like, I didn't come for that. I came to take their gold.
It's not my business.
It's not what I'm here for.
Yeah.
But Enriquillo encountered some of the priests that were running around and found some inspiration in it.
So it wasn't necessarily forced on him. He saw something that he may have liked and took what he wanted of that and incorporated it.
We'd like to hope so, on some level.
Right.
I would say that there's no place a Taino person could be unfree and make a free choice, right? You're never going to encounter anything about the outside world without some level of violence. But just like Native people everywhere, they selectively incorporated aspects of new cultures and new ideas to aid their survival.
Yeah.
Right? Just like he adopted European military technology, right, and food sources. He adopted parts of the spirituality that aided in their survival. And there's a great quote by the governor of the island at that time. It's like, when we first came here, it was easy. They didn't know us. But now we're fighting people who have been raised among us, and they know our ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the Catholic faith was one of those ingredients that helped carve out this space of survival.
So a lot of us grapple with the history of the Plains Indians and of this area. The ghost dance, the Black Elk's history, and the meeting with Indigenous Catholic faith, that type of thing. How do Enriquillo's life and faith instruct us in a Native American Catholic context?
I think it helps us to take more seriously the utility of Christian faith for Native peoples who engaged it. There's this very interesting correlation with people who resisted colonization, but did so through the inspiration or active participation in the idea of a savior. In the ghost dance, the whole movement was based on Wanikia, he who makes live. The idea that Jesus was an Indian, was coming back, and is going to bring the world back to the way it was. Like somehow, this injustice, this pain, this destruction is not the final answer. And you find that across the Americas, not all Indigenous people felt that way, and certainly colonizers were very intentional about trying to give a different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? The white Jesus that tells you, you've got to become white in order to be saved.
Right.
But I think in the case of Enriquillo, just like with Black Elk, that was an ingredient, a sort of eternal principle of justice that was bigger than these newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they tried to twist it, even if they manipulated it, you had that to say, no, there's something bigger than you and your twisted greed.
Right. And he and his people are going to live beyond that, for sure. Yeah. And that's part of his legacy. But what do you think that his what's the legacy that he leaves behind?
I think it's a legacy that has not begun to be appreciated. We in our own country, and then in Latin America, there's always the founding fathers, right? The people who created these new social orders that are based on justice and freedom. And if we could just get back to that, boy, we'd all be in a great place.
Right.
Enriquillo, I think, is the first person, right, founding father, founding mother, who really worked to create a society based on equality and justice, who really took those ideas seriously and worked to make them real for his people. And I think worked to make them real for all the people he encountered. He was not driven by revenge. I think he wanted to see all people as people. And so I think it's important to recognize him as, like, when we start our lineage at St. Joseph's, or as Native Catholics or Native people or settler people who are trying to live in right relationship on this land, that's who we should look to as our founding father, and say, okay, we can do better because we know somebody who did better in far worse situation.
Right. Would that we could all have that kind of legacy behind us. That'd be dynamite. Yeah.
And I think also in particularly a Catholic context, right? I know for a lot of people, the rosary is a very sort of stale or feels like an old relic from the past. And I think in the hands of Enriquillo, like when he's praying this at night in the mountains, knowing that any second the conquistadors could show up and this could all end. Like, that's a live, living spirituality. That's a real connection, right? And to pray the rosary in that way, where we are, for the challenges we face, I think that's an example a witness that can be speak to us today.
I agree with. So Damien, thank you once again for joining us here at Ho-Chokeh at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School campus, where we talk about issues central to Native American education today. Until next time, stay centered.